All right, so are we having fun yet? What I'm going to do today is go over chapter 21, which is the PowerPoint presentation for the book. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over it relatively quickly because we've already covered a lot of it in the digestion PowerPoint, but there are some slides and figures here that I want you to pay attention to. All right, so the chapter is just going to be the same that we talked about before. It's literally transiting through the digestive tract all the way from mouth to anus. So we're going to go through and see exactly what happens in more detail, in particular in the stomach, and look at the endocrine responses. Because one of the things that I want you to do is to be able to follow food as it goes all the way through the GI tract. So we're going to go through that process, and we already said that the mouth contributes saliva, salivary amylase, as well as lipase, and you have different activators that stimulate those enzymes, and particularly salivary amylase is stimulated by chloride. So we said that absorption is going to take place mostly within the small intestine, but you have a small amount of some things absorbed in the mouth and even in the stomach. For instance, in the stomach, you get absorption of fluid as well as alcohol. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with when you drink something on an empty stomach, particularly an alcoholic beverage, it gets absorbed quicker and you feel the effects. If you have food in the stomach, it tends to delay the absorption, and that then decreases your blood level of alcohol and it rises slower. So all through the GI tract, we saw that peristalsis occurs, and remember that peristalsis is really going to be controlled by the enteric nervous system. You also have input from the autonomic nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic pathways. So when you're looking at the transit from the mouth to the stomach, you've got to go through the esophagus, and the esophagus also has peristalsis going on. And when it reaches the stomach, you actually have different parts of the stomach. The stomach has rugae, which are folds within it. It secretes acid, as we said, and we said that the mucus helps to protect the lining of the stomach. So saliva helps to lubricate and soften foods. We talked about cystic fibrosis previously when we dealt with the lung. Cystic fibrosis can cause a thickening of the mucus because of a disruption in one of the CTFR chloride channels, and that literally makes the mucus very thick within the lungs as well as even in the stomach and GI tract. And that leads to infections like in the lung. You get all sorts of opportunistic infections, particularly Pseudomonas. You also get problems with absorption in the GI tract because the mucus is so thick, so it becomes really problematic. We said that salivary amylase is found in saliva. The teeth also help to chew or masticate the food, and you have some individuals secreting substances like IgA. So immunoglobulin A is one of the methods to prevent certain pathogens like the typical coronavirus, for instance. So if you have had coronavirus before, you may have IgG in your bloodstream, but you'll also produce IgA within your mucous membranes, and that gets secreted to try to prevent any other infection with viruses or bacteria. So this slide is important because it gives you an idea of the endocrine system, and particularly what happens within the stomach with all the different cells. You see Parietal cells are the cells that secrete acid as well as intrinsic factor. You also have inner chromaffin-like cells that release histamine, and histamine is one of the signals for the parietal cells to secrete acid. So it's going to stimulate the release of gastrin as well as acetylcholine, and that in turn, the acetylcholine stimulates the gastric acid secretion. Chief cells secrete or stimulate the secretion of pepsinogen as well as gastric lipase. So you have a number of different lipases, both from the saliva as well as from the stomach, that potentially can assist the breakdown of fat. We already said that the liver secretes bile that helps to emulsify the fat. Delta or D cells secrete somatostatin, which literally helps to inhibit the gastric acid secretion. And the G cells secrete gastrin, which is one of the substances that helps to also stimulate gastric acid secretion. All right, so this shows as a good slide showing the feedback systems that are in place. I'm sure that you've seen different types of agents that either inhibit acid secretion in the stomach or are sold to treat things like heartburn. So, for instance, the antacids that you take, like Tums, are typically going to be calcium carbonate, so they react directly with the acid that has already been secreted by the stomach. You also have medications like Pepsid, as well as other agents like Tagamet, which are H2 blockers. And what the H2 blocker stands for is histamine blocker. So it blocks the binding of histamine to its receptor, and that actually stimulates the acid production. So if you block that, you are going to inhibit acid secretion by the stomach. And as we already said, the parietal cells are the cells that secrete the acid. So there's another agent called proton pump inhibitors. For instance, omeprazole is a proton pump inhibitor that inhibits those parietal cells from releasing the acid. So it's really a complex feedback system that every time something enters the stomach or the small intestine, depending on what that substance is, it may stimulate the release of a particular agent that really gets the digestive process going, and it can also stimulate succeeding regions of the GI tract to actually be ready to receive that substance. So, for instance, when lipids get into the small intestine, we already saw that that stimulates the secretion of cholecystokinin by the small intestinal cells. And cholecystokinin stimulates the gallbladder to contract, which, remember, the gallbladder stores bile, which is the emulsifying agent, and it also stimulates the production and release of pancreatic enzymes. So it's a very efficient process that is well choreographed to keep things flowing. Secretin is another hormone that stimulates the release, typically, of enzymes by the pancreas. The pyloric sphincter is the region of the stomach that determines how much chyme or foodstuff is released into the small intestine, and it only allows certain size particles to enter into the small intestine. You also have gastric inhibitory peptides. So once food has gotten into the small intestine, you get gastric inhibitory peptides secreted so that no more is released until that has actually been absorbed and processed by the small intestine. So here you see an overall overview of all the organs in the intestine. Remember, within the small intestine, you have the microvilli that are occurring to increase the surface area. So this just talks about the three portions of the small intestine, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. You have the pancreas, the liver. Remember that the small intestine resorbs by far the bulk of the water, but whatever water is remaining by the time it gets to the large intestine is absorbed there. You only retain enough water to keep the feces lubricated, and some individuals get constipated and the large intestine keeps absorbing the water, and that can actually cause the feces to get impacted. So if you have feces impacted in the colon, that can be a severe situation, and physicians may actually need to go in and remove some of that impacted stool to be able to get things flowing again. Otherwise, you may actually have an obstruction occurring. All right, so more just going through the whole process. The stomach wall has the different sections. I'm not really interested, but notice that within, all throughout the intestine, you have parts of the immune system, which can be found in these Peyer's patches, which are congregations of immune cells that really surveil for any potential bacteria that may have made their way through the intestinal wall. All right, so that's just a histological overview showing more of the microvilli. That's just more about peristalsis. And you can see here that each one of the areas within the GI tract, you have secretion of substances, like the stomach may in a day secrete 2 liters of gastric secretions. The pancreas maybe 1.5 liters. The intestine another 1.5 liters, so that by the time you've made your way through, you've absorbed or secreted 9 liters. By far the bulk of that you've got to resorb. Just like the kidney, when it filters 200 liters of fluid a day, you've got to resorb most of that, otherwise you're going to be quickly dehydrated. And that's why in many cases, patients who have diarrheal diseases lose this ability, because typically diarrheal toxins and bacterial toxins stimulate the release of the fluid, and it prevents the absorption by interfering with the pumping of sodium through the cells. All right, we've talked about the different enzymes that are present to digest disaccharides, and those are present in the small intestinal wall. Typically, you have amylase, you have maltase that digests maltose, sucrase digests sucrose, so that converts it to glucose and fructose, and lactase converts or gets rid of the lactose. You can literally buy lactase in the supermarket. People who are lactose intolerant can take lactase when they drink milk, and that helps them to digest the milk sugar. So this just shows the disaccharides, which cannot be absorbed, being converted to monosaccharides, which have specific transport methods that are found in particular in the small intestinal mucosa. So that just talks about the absorption. Most proteins, larger proteins, cannot be absorbed, but smaller polypeptides can. One of the features of infants is that infants, typically up to the age of approximately 6 months, don't have acid being produced in their stomach. So it's thought that that helps to prevent the digestion of many of the maternal antibodies that the baby is absorbing from mother's milk if they're breastfed. So that's one of the good reasons why mothers are encouraged to breastfeed, because they can transfer immunity to their babies via the antibody that is secreted in breast milk. So that's one of the large advantages of breastfeeding. because we'll talk about the immune system in chapter 24. Babies in their first 2 weeks of life have relatively little capacity to fight against any infections that they happen to get. So one of the what's known as passive immunity is conferred by antibody that is transferred across the placental membrane before birth, but also after the baby is born, you get the ingestion of breast milk, and breast milk has maternal antibodies secreted into it as well. So looking at the different enzymes, you have various proteases that can either be classified as endopeptidases or exopeptidases. So the exopeptidases cleave from the ends. The endopeptidases can cleave in the middle of different proteins, and those then help to digest the fragments into smaller and smaller chains, and ultimately you can get amino acids and relatively small peptides being absorbed in the small intestine. We already talked about emulsification and the enzymes that can enter into those micelles once the fat has been emulsified include the different lipases, which come, as we said, from the saliva, the stomach, as well as even the pancreas. So you also have colipase that's secreted by the pancreas, and phospholipases also secreted by the pancreas. Remember that triglycerides are not able to be absorbed. You can only absorb monoglycerides or fatty acids. And remember that the longer chain fatty acids have to be then reconverted into chylomicrons, which go into the lymphatic system and then are ultimately reabsorbed into the venous circulation. And this just shows that. All right. I'm not going to get into the different reflexes, but again, you have that enteric nervous system. So you literally, the GI tract is active at all times. And when you listen and put a stethoscope on the stomach, you can hear the bowel sounds constantly occurring because everything is moving and constantly circulating to try to get mixing, and you literally